Welcome back to Silicon Wafers, and in today's episode, we focus on the blistering new front in the war in Ukraine, energy warfare, and that is taking place inside Russia. What does this mean for Putin's war machine and his regime? We'll walk through four interlinked stories: Ukraine's strikes on Russian refineries and the fuel shock inside Russia itself. Secondly, Russia's pivot to Asian gasoline imports and its refining base crumbles. Three, Trump's green light for the US intelligence sharing aimed at helping Ukraine to strike Russian energy targets with greater accuracy. And finally, what all this reveals about Putin's war, domestic repression, and regime brittleness. Before we jump into that, thank you to everyone who supports the channel through Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. It is a massive assistance. And also, please, I want to draw your attention to the fundraiser we've got going. We are looking to get 2 trucks for the 93rd Battalion. This is one of the most successful divisions in Ukraine, and they desperately need these vehicles to help themselves become even more resilient and effective against Russian aggression. So please find the links to that campaign in the description below, and later in the episode we will have a couple of words from some of the representatives of the 93rd Battalion of Holodny Yar. Ukraine strikes on Russian refineries, fuel lines, export bans, price shocks. For 4 years, Ukraine's military campaign has largely focused on military sites, barracks, command posts, supply lines. But in recent weeks, a new vector has burst into view: the decapitation of Russia's refining and fuel infrastructure. According to the Kiev Independent, Ukraine's sustained campaign of strikes on refineries is now causing havoc at gas stations in Russia and occupied Crimea, with prices skyrocketing and short-term shortages widely reported. That is from an article by Karol Luska, October 1st, 2025, in the Kiev Independent, and the scale is absolutely staggering. The Kiev Post reports that Ukrainian drone attacks have affected or potentially even crippled nearly 40% of Russia's oil refining capacity, triggering the country's worst fuel shortage in decades. That is written by Alisa Orlova on October 1st in the Kiev Post. This is dramatically up from the 18% or so impact on refining capacity reported just last week. On key days, Russia's refining throughput has slumped by nearly 20%, taking roughly 1.1 million barrels per day offline. Wholesale fuel prices have jumped sharply, and some refineries have been hit 2 or even 3 times. That's from the Kiev Independent. Inside Russia, the picture is grim. In Crimea, authorities froze diesel and gasoline prices for 30 days and rationed purchases at 30 litres per vehicle. That's according to Reuters. In the Far East, parts of the Kuril Islands have run out of gasoline entirely. Officials declared that the sale of AI-92 gasoline to the public has been temporarily suspended. The entire supply is needed for special vehicles, according to the Moscow Times. In Moscow and Nizhny Novgorod, Lukoil reportedly banned sales and jerry cans and stopped accepting fuel cards at certain stations in an attempt to curb panic buying. In some regions, consumers can't find the usual fuel grades AI-92 and AI-95, the staples of everyday Russian motorists. From the Moscow Times, Jason Kokorin writes, in an energy superpower, shortages at the pump pose a political problem for Vladimir Putin, who's tried to portray his aggression in Ukraine as not impacting the daily lives of Russians. That's from his article, Putin Can't Hide Russia's Gasoline Crisis, and that was penned on September 30th. Well, that's the paradox. Russia is supposed to dominate global energy supply, yet within its own borders, its citizens are queuing for fuel. The Kremlin is trying to paper over the cracks, blaming transport bottlenecks, scheduled maintenance, or bad weather, but the scale of disruptions is too wide to be dismissed as coincidence. That's reported in the Moscow Times. What Ukraine is doing here is striking a dual-use target. Energy infrastructure powers both Russia's war machine, fuel for vehicles, generators, logistics, but it also props up its finances via exports. By hitting refineries, Ukraine forces Moscow into painful trade-offs: protect exports or feed its domestic front, or the military. Russia is to now import gasoline from Asia as its refining base collapses. Struck by internal shortages, Moscow is now scrabbling to look outward and eastward for relief. Newsweek reports that Russia is set to import gasoline from Asia to offset a growing fuel shortage, since Ukrainian attacks have disrupted nearly 40% of the country's oil refining capacity. Earlier, Kiev independent coverage noted that, following strikes on the Salvolat refinery, a major facility in Bashkortostan, Russia extended bans on gasoline exports and considered new diesel restrictions to preserve domestic supply. Russia's producers and state planners are signaling that they will lean on China and other Asian partners to fill the gap, but this is not a neat fix. At the same time, Russia has extended gasoline export bans through the year's end and is considering partial diesel export restrictions. That's according to Reuters. That said, analysts are skeptical that these export bans will have much effect on freeing up domestic supply. Many of Russia's largest diesel export volumes move through pipeline systems or producer-controlled channels, which may be exempt or harder to constrain. But there's a geopolitical catch. Who will supply Russia under sanctions pressure? China is an obvious candidate. Its semi-strategic alignment with Russia morphs into transactional energy diplomacy. India, of course, is another possible source. They've shown themselves quite prepared to put profit ahead of any kind of morality. With Indian oil firms stepping in, per recent reports, that comes from the Economic Times. But buying in refined oil products will dramatically accelerate Russia's deepening financial crisis. It will be squeezed on the margin it makes, selling crude, often through illegal, sanctions-busting routes, and then it will pay through the nose to receive refined oil product back again through the same illegal routes. This is possibly the dumbest economic exchange in the history of modern geopolitics. Well done, Mr. Putin. You remain a master strategist. This increased dependency may create new pressure points as well. If China supplies fuel to Russia under sanction regimes, it risks backlash from the US and Europe. For Beijing, the calculus becomes how much strategic alignment is worth the reputational, financial, and diplomatic cost. The shift also raises the spectre that China may demand stronger strategic concessions, energy prices, influence over Russian foreign policy, or access to Russian infrastructure in return for its support. And domestically, the cost will ultimately be borne by Russian consumers and, of course, the local so-called elites. Before we move on to the next question, I'd like to make a personal recommendation that I know you will appreciate. You may have seen my interview last week with the producer of the film series Kiev of Mine, Ronnie Apteker. Well, I've partnered with them to help raise awareness of what I believe is an important series of films made for a Western audience to help break through absurd stereotypes about Ukraine, some of which, of course, are amplified by Russian propaganda. You can watch these films for free now. Details in a second. Kiev of Mine is a documentary series about Ukraine's extraordinary capital, which I had the privilege to visit for the first time in January this year. The film production began in 2018, and of course much has changed since then. It's now 2025, and the story is far from over. Kiev of Mine is a fast-paced, beautifully filmed, humorous, fun, insightful, heartbreaking, moving, and hopeful work. The very antithesis, in fact, of a doom-laden and worthy wartime documentary. This is a work that is extraordinarily uplifting. My friend, operator Starsky, says the film is made with so much love. The film series will make you laugh and cry. It's the only film about Ukraine that began before the war, yet has traced lives through the tumultuous times, and which follows the lives of more than a dozen Ukrainians in real time. This is an historic period told through highly personal and emotive stories from Kiev's days of emerging prosperity after the Maidan Revolution through COVID and the full-scale invasion. This film is a breath of fresh air. Ukraine deserves a better conversation in the world, one that isn't centered around war, says Julian Ellis, filmmaker on Kiev of Mine. It's hard not to argue with that, and the filmmakers have fully delivered on this promise. This is essential watching for anyone who calls themselves pro-Ukrainian, but I think it's also vital to get friends, colleagues, and family to watch it too, because the reality is few people have a vivid impression of Ukraine or any direct connection with its people. War is inhumane and abstract. Building an alternative perception is essential for engaging the world with the importance of Ukraine's struggle. Next, Trump greenlights US intelligence sharing for Ukraine's long-range attacks. Perhaps the most game-changing development of recent days, the Biden-era reluctance to empower Ukraine to strike deep into Russia, especially against its energy assets, is giving way under a new administration, and that will come as a surprise to many. According to Reuters, the United States will provide Ukraine with intelligence on long-range energy infrastructure targets inside Russia, enabling Kiev to strike refineries, pipelines, and power plants more effectively. That's according to Reuters. The Guardian similarly reports that the Trump administration has signaled support for intelligence sharing and is weighing the supply of US-made Tomahawk missiles, which have the range to penetrate deep into Russian territory. Inside Moscow, officials are already bristling at the move, and the shift signals a recalibration of US policy, not just supporting Ukraine defensively, but enabling a strategic counter-offensive. That's from Reuters. And this indeed is a turning point if it's followed through. Up to now, Ukraine's long-range campaigns, including drone strikes, relied heavily on its own evolving capacity and covert Western support. But with formal US intelligence baked into target planning, the reach and scale of Ukrainian operations against Russian energy infrastructure will increase. And so, of course, will the stakes. For Russia, this means that every refinery, pipeline, or power plant becomes a potential target. Moscow must now allocate more of its scarce air defenses, repair resources, and internal security apparatus to guard critical energy nodes. That forces trade-offs, either defend infrastructure or redeploy defenses to the front lines, or for internal suppression. You will not be able to do all of these things. Moreover, the optics of US collaboration send a message. The war isn't just reclaiming Ukrainian territory, but it's also become about dismantling Russia's war finance base, its war machine itself, making long-term occupation or aggression prohibitively costly. We will finally see the decarbonization, the decolonization, the de-imperialization of the Russian economy. And Putin can't hide behind the gasoline crisis. The implications of this for his repressive machine, his war machine, are potentially deep. Finally, what does all this turmoil at the pumps say about the resilience or fragility of Putin's regime and Russia's war machine? The Moscow Times piece, "Putin Can't Hide Russia's Gasoline Crisis," cuts to the heart of it. The outages have cut Russia's refining capacity, equal to about 1.1 million barrels per day. On some days, Russia's refining capacity has collapsed by nearly a fifth, with exports from key ports sharply curtailed. That's by Jason Kokorin, September 30th. Moscow Times. Kokorin describes how the Kremlin is even denying fuel export bans, while insiders admit that rationing and shortages are real. He writes, "This is not a sacrifice, it is extortion of a country already under pressure by the regime that is supposed to govern in its interests." VEB, the State Development Bank, forecasts 2 quarters of GDP contraction, a clear recession signal. Even the head of Sberbank admits that the economy is in technical stagnation. That's according To the Moscow Times, Putin's spin doctors are spinning faster and faster daily, it seems. The Kremlin claims that citizens are completely united around President Putin and ready to shoulder any burden. That's according to Dmitry Peskov, his spokesman. But such reframes may falter if everyday life, availability of fuel, food, transport, and in the winter months, heating starts to collapse. Here we see the collision of three pressures. One, operational strain on the war machine. Fuel is essential for logistics, mechanized units, aviation, and electrical backup in occupied territories. Disrupting refining capacity hampers Russia's ability to maintain offensive tempo, resupply remote fronts, and sustain its military infrastructure. Secondly, there is the fiscal crisis and resource allocation stress. Russia's war budget has been strained by sanctions, dropping oil revenues, and now the internal fuel crisis. The regime may face a day of reckoning in choosing whether to prioritize internal subsidies or external aggression. Three, political legitimacy and authoritarian survival. At the margins, ordinary Russians are now tangibly feeling the war's costs, whether it's a shutdown of aviation or the shutdown of fuel at the pumps. When an authoritarian regime depends on control over information, repression, and controlling the narrative, everyday shortages pose a legitimacy threat. Struggles for fuel are harder to deny, harder to reframe and cover up. Everyone can experience them. Putin must now thread a needle, retain coercive control, maintain the war in Ukraine, and avoid internal collapse, all while revenues shrink and external dependencies grow. This fuel crisis seems to draw Russia more tightly into China's sphere, but too much dependency can erode autonomy. China may demand more concessions in exchange for fuel and refining support, or use the leverage to expand influence over Russia's Far East and energy corridors. Meanwhile, the US, by backing Ukraine's strikes, uses Russia's energy weakness as a lever of asymmetric pressure, undermining Moscow's global posture. If Russia cannot even fuel its own roadways, its own consumers, it will struggle to act as the global authoritarian counterpoint to the liberal democratic order. A final word from our partners, the makers of Kiev of Mine. All three films are now available to watch for free on YouTube. Please check out the links to the dedicated website, which tells you more about the film, its subjects, and the filmmakers. Also in the description is a link to the YouTube channel where you can watch the films now. Do let us know in the comments what you think of them and if they inspire you as much as they have inspired me.